the practice note, drafting process, and location analysis. We've examined numbers that revealed insider knowledge and handwriting that couldn't be excluded. We've traced through windows that stayed closed and maternal hearing that should have detected what neighbors heard. And now we need to pause at something that sits quietly in the investigation reports, something that whispers about time and process and the comfort required to do certain things in certain places. We need to think about what wasn't found on the stairs that morning. We need to think about the pages that came before the final note, the attempts that were started and abandoned, the drafts that would have proceeded, arriving at those 2.5 pages of careful characterization and elaborate threat. Because here's what sits beneath the surface of that finished note: asking to be noticed. Writing that much with that level of detail, with that sustained characterization, doesn't happen in a single attempt. There are false starts. There are pages where the tone isn't quite right, where the phrasing doesn't achieve what the writer needs it to achieve. There are attempts that get crumpled and discarded before the final version emerges. And the absence of those attempts in the discovered evidence, the question of what happened to them and what their absence reveals, becomes one more thread in the pattern of time and comfort and extended presence that refuses to align with the narrative we were given. Let's establish what we understand about writing process before we begin to interpret what the absence of practice pages means. From a psychological perspective, when people write something important, something on which significant consequences depend, they rarely produce a perfect final draft in their first attempt. They compose, reconsider, revise. They might start with one approach, decide it doesn't work, begin again. They might write several sentences or paragraphs, realize the tone is wrong, crumple the page, and start fresh. This iterative process is how most writing actually happens, especially writing that requires sustained attention to voice and characterization. And the longer the final document, the more likely there were attempts that preceded it, pages that represented earlier efforts to achieve what the final version accomplished. So, when we're looking at a 2.5-page ransom note with detailed characterization and specific word choices, we're almost certainly looking at the product of a drafting process, not a single perfect attempt. And that drafting process would have left evidence, pages that were started and abandoned, attempts that didn't quite achieve what the writer needed them to achieve. Theme 1. The architecture of composition. What writing requires and reveals. When we think about the process of composing that ransom note, we need to think about time and what time reveals about circumstance. From a logical perspective, writing 2.5 pages of detailed text in someone else's handwriting, attempting to disguise your natural hand while maintaining characterization and coherent narrative, takes time. Conservative estimates suggest 15 to 20 minutes minimum for the final version alone, possibly longer if the writer was thinking between sentences, monitoring their disguise, ensuring consistency. But that's just the final version. If we accept that there were likely earlier attempts, practice runs, pages that were started and abandoned because they didn't achieve the right tone, or because the disguise wasn't working, or because the phrasing revealed too much, then we're talking about significantly more time, perhaps 30 to 40 minutes, perhaps even longer. And every minute spent in that location, engaged in that task, tells us something about the writer's circumstances and their relationship to that house. Let's think about what comfort means in this context. From a psychological perspective, writing requires a certain baseline of physical and psychological comfort. You need to be able to sit or stand in a position that allows sustained hand movement. You need lighting sufficient to see what you're writing. You need to feel secure enough in your location that you're not constantly listening for approaching footsteps, not repeatedly checking over your shoulder, not in a state of such acute stress that sustained hand-eye coordination becomes difficult. And you need the cognitive space to focus on the content you're producing, the characterization, the word choices, the maintenance of whatever voice or persona you're trying to create. From a physiological standpoint, someone operating in acute fear of discovery wouldn't have these conditions. Stress hormones would impair fine motor control. Hypervigilance would fragment attention. The constant threat of discovery would make sustained focus nearly impossible. Now, let's consider what the absence of practice pages tells us about what happened to them. From a criminological perspective, there are limited possibilities. Either no practice pages existed. The final note was written in a single perfect attempt, which strains credibility given its length and the likely cognitive load of attempting disguise while composing. Or practice pages existed but were taken by whoever wrote them, gathered up carefully, removed from the scene, disposed of elsewhere because their presence would have revealed too much about the drafting process and the time it required. Or practice pages existed but were disposed of within the house, perhaps burned, perhaps torn to tiny pieces, and flushed or scattered in ways that made them unrecoverable. Each of these possibilities tells us something about the writer's circumstances. If pages were taken away, that suggests someone who could leave the house and dispose of evidence elsewhere. If they were destroyed within the house, that suggests someone who had access to disposal methods and time to use them. And if somehow no practice pages existed, that suggests a writer with such complete control over their circumstances that they could achieve in a single attempt what most people would require multiple attempts to accomplish. Let's shift to thinking about where this drafting would have occurred. We've established that the evidence clusters around the butler's kitchen area. The notepad was there. Pens were available in that catch-all space. The final note was placed on the nearby spiral stairs. From an anthropological perspective, when people engage in tasks that require sustained attention and multiple attempts, they typically don't move locations between attempts. They settle in one place that meets their needs, adequate surface to write on, access to materials, sufficient comfort to sustain the work. So if practice pages existed, they were likely produced in the same general area where the final note was written. Someone sat or stood in that butler's kitchen area, perhaps at the small table, perhaps using countertop space, and worked through the process of arriving at the final version. And they did this over a period of time, not rushed minutes, but extended time that speaks to comfort rather than urgent fear of discovery. From a philosophical perspective, we need to ask, what does it mean to spend this kind of time on a document that claims to be from someone in a hurry? The note itself suggests urgency, demands to be followed, threats of consequences, the framing of someone who has accomplished a kidnapping and needs to communicate demands quickly before circumstances change. But the existence of a drafting process, The time required to work through multiple attempts and arrive at a polished final version contradicts that urgency. It suggests someone who wasn't actually in a hurry, who had time to invest in getting the document right, who could afford to work through the iterative process of composition without fear that their extended presence in that location would lead to discovery. This contradiction between the urgency the note claims and the time the note's creation required becomes evidence about the writer's actual circumstances versus the circumstances they were trying to create the impression of. From a physiological standpoint, let's think about what extended writing under stress does to the body and what signs that would leave. If someone was writing under genuine fear of discovery, we would expect evidence of that stress in the handwriting itself. Inconsistent pressure as stress hormones fluctuated, perhaps tremor in certain letters, variation in quality between early attempts and later ones as fatigue or emotional state changed. But if the handwriting remained relatively consistent across the length of the final document, if pressure and letter formation stayed stable, that suggests the writer wasn't in the kind of acute stress state that would exist for someone in genuine danger of discovery. They were stressed, certainly. The circumstances would create stress regardless. But it was a different kind of stress than acute fear of imminent discovery. It was the stress of processing terrible circumstances and trying to create a document that would serve a crucial purpose, but without the layered physiological stress of needing to hurry, needing to listen constantly for approaching danger. From a criminological perspective, we can compare this drafting process to what we see in other cases of staged evidence. When people create false documents as part of staging, the time they invest reveals their priorities and their circumstances. Someone genuinely worried about being discovered by occupants or by arriving police doesn't invest significant time in revising and perfecting their staged evidence. They create something quick and functional, something that serves the immediate purpose, and then they remove themselves from the scene as rapidly as possible. But when we see evidence of extended drafting, of multiple attempts, of investment in getting the document exactly right, we're seeing someone whose priorities were different. For them, the quality of the staging mattered more than immediate departure. And that suggests someone who wasn't actually at risk of discovery in the way an intruder would be. Someone who could afford to take the time to get it right, because their presence in that house wasn't inherently problematic, because they weren't operating under the time pressure that would exist for someone who didn't belong there. So when we step back and consider the architecture of composition, the time required, the drafting process implied, the comfort level needed, the absence of practice pages that should exist if that process occurred, the contradiction between claimed urgency and actual investment of time. We're looking at evidence that transforms our understanding of who could have written that note and under what circumstances. From every analytical perspective, logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and criminological, the composition process reveals someone who had time, who had comfort, who had access to materials and space, and the psychological capacity to engage in iterative writing without acute fear of immediate discovery. That's not consistent with an intruder operating in a hostile environment where every minute increases risk. That's consistent with someone who belonged in that house, for whom extended presence in the kitchen area wasn't inherently dangerous, who could afford the time to work through multiple attempts because they weren't racing against discovery by occupants who might wake at any moment. The composition process itself becomes evidence, revealing through the time it required and the comfort it presupposed circumstances that align only with someone already embedded in that space, someone for whom the house was home rather than hostile territory. Theme 2. The geography of extended presence. What time in space? Reveals. We've established that the composition required extended time, and now we need to think about what that extended time in that specific location reveals about the writer's relationship to that space. Because it's not just that someone spent time writing, it's where they spent that time, how they used that space, what their comfort in that location tells us about their familiarity with and belonging in that house. From a criminological perspective, people's use of space reveals their relationship to it. Someone who doesn't belong, who is operating illicitly in a location, moves through that space differently than someone who belongs there. They minimize their presence, avoid settling in, maintain readiness to depart quickly. But someone who is composing documents that require extended focus, who is using kitchen materials, who is apparently working through multiple drafts in a sustained way, that's someone who has claimed that space, who is comfortable enough to settle into extended activity without constant fear of interruption. Let's think about what the butler's kitchen area represents in the architecture of that house. From an anthropological perspective, kitchens are intimate family spaces, places where daily life unfolds, where people move without formality, where comfort and familiarity allow for sustained activity. The butler's kitchen wasn't a formal space like a living room where guests might be received. It was a working space, a family utility area, the kind of location where people who lived in the house would naturally settle for tasks requiring time and focus. And choosing this space for extended writing tells us something about the writer's relationship to the house. An intruder, even one brazen enough to spend time in an occupied home, would likely choose a space closer to exits, a location where they could monitor approaches, somewhere that didn't require them to settle deep into the family's daily use areas, but someone comfortable in that house, someone for whom the butler's kitchen was a familiar and unremarkable location, might naturally gravitate there because it had what they needed: surfaces to work on, materials at hand, the kind of unremarkable utility that made it feel like the right place for the task. From a psychological perspective, we need to think about what it means to spend extended time in a location where you could be discovered at any moment. If parents are sleeping upstairs, if there's genuine risk that someone might wake and investigate unusual sounds or notice lights on in areas that should be dark, how does that awareness affect your behavior? From a physiological standpoint, that kind of sustained threat creates chronic stress activation, elevated cortisol, heightened startle response, divided attention between the task at hand and monitoring for approaching danger. It's exhausting, cognitively depleting, the kind of state that makes sustained focus on complex tasks difficult. So, if someone was able to settle into extended drafting, to work through multiple attempts at getting the tone and content right, that suggests they weren't operating under that kind of sustained threat awareness. They felt secure enough in their activity, confident enough that discovery wasn't imminent, that they could invest attention in the writing, rather than in constant vigilance about their environment. Now let's consider what else would have been happening during those extended hours in that space. If the note writing took 30, 40, perhaps even more minutes when we account for multiple attempts, and if other staging activities were also occurring, positioning items, making decisions about what the scene needed to look like, perhaps moving between floors to assess and adjust, we're talking about hours, plural, spent in various locations throughout the house. From a logical perspective, this extended presence creates a timeline problem for the intruder narrative. How long would a genuine intruder remain in an occupied house? The answer in most criminal cases: as briefly as possible. Execute the plan. Create whatever staging is necessary quickly. Depart before risk of discovery escalates beyond acceptable levels. But what we're asked to believe here is that someone spent multiple hours in that house, engaging in activities that required focus and sustained attention, without apparently worrying that their extended presence dramatically increased their exposure to discovery. Let's shift to thinking about what sustained activity in the butler's kitchen area would require in terms of resources and comfort. The writer needed light sufficient to see what they were writing without straining. They needed a writing surface, something stable enough to support the physical act of writing over an extended period. They needed to be able to sit or stand in a position sustainable for the time required. And they apparently had access to the notepad and pens, knew where those materials were stored, could find them without extensive searching, even in the middle of the night. From an anthropological lens, this kind of resource access and environmental fluency comes from familiarity. It's the difference between someone navigating a space they've been in many times and someone trying to find what they need in an unfamiliar environment. The writer's apparent ease in accessing materials, settling into a location suitable for extended work, and using that space comfortably for a sustained period all suggest deep familiarity rather than first-time navigation. From a philosophical perspective, we need to ask, what does comfort in space reveal about consciousness and belonging? Space isn't neutral. It carries meaning. It feels different depending on our relationship to it. Our own homes feel different than houses we're visiting, which feel different than spaces we're occupying illicitly. And those differences affect our behavior, our stress levels, our willingness to settle into extended activity. Someone writing that note in the butler's kitchen area was operating in a space that allowed for the kind of sustained, focused activity that requires baseline comfort. Not comfort in the sense of being happy or at ease with circumstances, but comfort in the sense of not being in a hostile environment, not being in constant fear of discovery by someone who belongs there and would recognize them as an intruder. That baseline comfort suggests someone for whom that space wasn't hostile, wasn't foreign, wasn't requiring constant vigilance simply by virtue of being there. From a criminological standpoint, when we map extended presence in specific locations against what we know about how people actually behave in different circumstances, the pattern tells a story. If someone had entered that house with criminal intent, if they were operating as an intruder, their use of space would be different. Quick movements, minimal settling, constant awareness of exits and approaches. But if someone was already a resident of that house, if their presence in the kitchen area was normal and unremarkable rather than transgressive, then extended activity there makes sense. They could settle in because they belonged there. They could take the time they needed because time in that location didn't inherently increase their risk. They could focus on the composition task because they weren't simultaneously managing the stress of being somewhere they shouldn't be, waiting for the moment when a resident would discover them and their entire plan would collapse. So when we consider the geography of extended presence, where the writing occurred, how long it took, what that time in that space reveals about comfort and familiarity and belonging, we're seeing evidence that compounds what the composition process already suggested. From every analytical perspective, logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and criminological, the extended presence in the butler's kitchen area tells us the writer wasn't operating as an intruder in hostile territory. They were operating as someone who knew that space, who felt comfortable settling into extended activity there, who had the kind of baseline security in that environment that only comes from belonging, from being someone for whom presence in that kitchen wasn't inherently problematic because it was their kitchen, their house, their space to use as they needed during those terrible hours when the impossible had to be faced and decisions had to be made about what came next. The geography of their presence, mapped across time, becomes evidence of relationship to space, evidence that refuses to support the intruder narrative while aligning perfectly with what we would expect if the person writing that note was someone who lived there, someone for whom extended time in the butler's kitchen was unremarkable because they had always belonged in that house. Theme 3, the disposal question. What happened to what should exist? We've established that practice pages likely existed and that extended time was spent in the composition. And now we need to confront perhaps the most revealing question of all. What happened to the pages that should exist but apparently weren't found? Because if the composition process required multiple attempts, if there were pages started and abandoned before arriving at the final version, then those pages had to go somewhere. They couldn't simply cease to exist. And their absence from the discovered evidence, the fact that only the final note was apparently found, with no preceding drafts, no crumpled attempts, no evidence of the iterative process that almost certainly occurred, tells us something crucial about who had the time, the resources, and the comfort to carefully dispose of evidence within that house. Let's think about what disposing of practice pages would require. From a logical perspective, there are limited methods available. You could burn them, but that requires access to a fireplace or some other means of combustion. It creates smoke and odor that might be detected. It takes time to ensure complete destruction. You could flush them, but paper, especially multiple pages, doesn't flush easily, creates risk of plumbing problems, leaves potential trace evidence. You could tear them into tiny pieces and scatter them. But that takes time, still leaves trace evidence that might be found, requires confidence that no fragment will be recovered and examined. Or you could take them with you when you leave, but that requires leaving the house at some point, having a vehicle or destination for disposal, accepting the risk of being found with evidence connecting you to the scene. From a criminological perspective, each of these disposal methods reveals something about the disposer's circumstances and their relationship to the house. From a psychological standpoint, the decision to dispose of practice pages shows awareness of what those pages would reveal. Someone who carefully gathered and destroyed early drafts understood that the existence of multiple attempts would tell investigators something important, that the writer had time, had engaged in an iterative process, had invested in getting the document right rather than simply producing something quick and functional. The practice pages, if found, would undermine narratives of urgency, would demonstrate extended presence and sustained focus, would reveal the kind of comfort and time investment we've been examining. So their disposal wasn't incidental. It was purposeful, someone understanding what those pages would expose and taking the time to ensure they wouldn't be found. And that level of awareness, that understanding of what evidence means and what it reveals, suggests not panicked response but calculated staging, someone thinking through what investigators would see and what needed to be concealed. Now, let's consider the timing of when disposal would have occurred. From a physiological perspective, if practice pages were created during the composition process, they would have needed to be disposed of either during that same time period or very shortly after. Leaving them visible in the butler's kitchen area or wherever composition occurred would create obvious problems. They would be discovered immediately when the household woke, would provide clear evidence of the drafting process and extended presence. So disposal had to happen during those same hours, during the same night, before circumstances changed. And that disposal required time that gets added to the already substantial time required for composition itself. We're not just talking about 20 or 30 minutes to write the final note. We're talking about the full process: drafting, revising, writing the final version, gathering up all the practice attempts, disposing of them thoroughly enough that they wouldn't be found. This compounds the timeline problem, extends the period during which someone was engaged in staging activities within that house. Let's shift to thinking about what different disposal methods would reveal about the disposer's access and comfort. If pages were burned, that suggests access to a fireplace or other burning location and confidence that the smoke and odor wouldn't create problems, either because the disposer knew no one would investigate, or because the time of night and home layout made such concerns minimal. If pages were flushed or torn and scattered, that suggests intimate knowledge of the house's layout, of where disposal could occur without leaving obvious evidence. If pages were taken away, that suggests the ability to leave the house and return, or to remain until morning when departure would be natural and unremarkable. From an anthropological lens, each disposal method presupposes a different relationship to the space and to time. And all of them presuppose something fundamental. The disposer had control over their circumstances in ways that an intruder simply wouldn't have. From a philosophical perspective, we need to think about what the absence of practice pages asks us to believe. The simplest explanation, that no practice pages existed, that the note was written perfectly in a single attempt, strains credibility given everything we know about writing processes and the cognitive load of attempting disguise while composing. So we're left with the conclusion that practice pages existed but were disposed of. And if they were disposed of, We need to ask, who had the time, the resources, the comfort, and the knowledge of the house to accomplish that disposal thoroughly enough that no trace was apparently found? An intruder operating in a hostile environment with parents sleeping upstairs would struggle to accomplish careful disposal. Time, pressure, stress, the need to minimize presence, and depart quickly. All of this would work against the kind of thorough disposal that would be required. But someone who lived in that house, who had hours to work with, who knew every space and possibility for disposal, who could move through the house without fear that their presence itself was problematic, that person could accomplish what the evidence suggests occurred. From a criminological standpoint, the disposal of practice pages represents a level of crime scene awareness and staging sophistication that creates problems for certain narratives. Someone who understood that practice pages would be revealing evidence, who took the time to gather and dispose of them thoroughly, who managed this alongside all the other staging elements. That's someone who wasn't operating in panic or chaos. That's someone who could think through what evidence meant, what would be found and what needed to be concealed, what the presence or absence of certain elements would tell investigators. This level of awareness suggests not the impulsive actions of a desperate criminal, but the calculated management of someone engaged in staging, someone who understood enough about investigation to know that the composition process itself would be examined and needed to be concealed. And that sophistication, combined with the time and access required for thorough disposal, points toward someone embedded in the house rather than someone operating from outside it. So when we consider the disposal question, what happened to pages that almost certainly existed, what their absence reveals about who had the time and resources and knowledge to dispose of them thoroughly, we see the final piece of evidence that the composition process provides. From every analytical perspective, logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and criminological, the absent practice pages tell us as much as the present final note. They tell us about extended time, about careful evidence management, about comfort and access, and the kind of control over circumstances that an intruder wouldn't have. They tell us about someone who could work through an iterative composition process and then thoroughly clean up the evidence of that process, someone who had the hours and the knowledge and the belonging that made such thorough staging possible. The practice pages are gone, carefully disappeared, but their absence speaks. It whispers about time that shouldn't have been available if an intruder was involved. It reveals comfort that shouldn't have existed if the writer was operating in hostile territory. It exposes the extended presence and calculated staging that the final note, sitting alone on those stairs, was meant to conceal. And perhaps what's most telling is that this element, the question of practice pages, of drafting process, of what their disposal required and what their absence reveals, has sat quietly in the case, rarely examined, seldom discussed, while attention focused on the final note's content rather than on what the process of producing that note tells us about the circumstances under which it was created and who could possibly have created it under those circumstances. We've walked through the composition process and what time requirements reveal, examined geography, and what extended presence in familiar space tells us, confronted the disposal question and what absence of practice pages exposes about access and belonging. What emerges isn't just understanding of how long that note took to write. It's recognition of what that time reveals about who could have written it and under what circumstances. The drafting process, mapped across time and space, tells a story of comfort, of familiarity, of someone who could settle into extended composition in the butler's kitchen area without fear that their presence itself was problematic. The absent practice pages whisper about hours spent not just writing, but managing evidence, disposing thoroughly of what would reveal too much about process and timeline. And the contradiction between the note's claimed urgency and the time its creation actually required becomes one more rupture in the narrative, one more gap, where what we're told doesn't align with what the evidence quietly suggests. Someone spent significant time in that house during those hours, not rushing, not operating under the acute time pressure an intruder would face, but investing what was needed to get the staging right. The composition process itself becomes witness, preserving in the time it required and the comfort it presupposed, a truth about who was writing and where they truly belonged. Not someone passing through, not someone in hostile territory counting every minute, but someone for whom that house was home. Someone for whom extended presence in the kitchen area was unremarkable because they had always belonged there. Someone who had the hours and the knowledge and the baseline security to work through drafting and disposal and staging, because the house wasn't their enemy. It was their shelter, their familiar space, the location where the terrible work of creating alternative explanations had to unfold during the darkest hours before dawn, when truth had to be buried beneath layers of carefully composed fiction meant to protect what remained of a family that could never be whole again.